No one can touch me.
Hey everyone, how's it going? As of late, I've been on a string of racing games for a while now, and while the wheels are still spinning, I do still have my mind on revisiting other genres for a change of pace and to keep things fresh. Saying that though, I will cover games that interest me, as I've always done. Speaking of interests, I've decided to take a look at the Dreamcast of all platforms. I never owned a Dreamcast as a kid. It was the original Xbox and PS2 that I have all of my 6th gen memories with. The console itself didn't do that well at all, but it was known for having some fantastic gems that would be ported over to other platforms, and there are still some die-hard fans that try to preserve the Dreamcast platform itself. I don't know a lot about the platform honestly, other than that it was ahead of its time as a console and what it was capable of. The tragedy of it though is that its potential was overshadowed by the domineering success of the PS2 and Sony's marketing strategies. This would lead to Sega noping out of the console market entirely after the Dreamcast. However, the legacy of this console would live on through the preservation of its hardware and in the digital space, which would enable me to try out not only one of the most unique titles on the platform, but would also sow the seed for some of the best racing games ever made, Tokyo Xtreme Racer for the Dreamcast. This is technically not the first game in the series, but an evolution spawned after a string of spin-off games released on earlier Sega platforms. They were also racing games embedded within the Japanese racing world, and would also be somewhat of a recreation of series like Wangan Midnight, where drivers would race at ludicrous speeds across the Shuto Expressway. Tokyo Xtreme Racer is the most notable of the bunch, and its successors would continue to improve the formula that it is built upon from before. Fast cars on a looping highway in the dead of night, seaming through traffic with arcade music and arcade physics. And this was all released in '99, which honestly, this game looks great for a game released around then. Hell, even some PS2 launch titles like Midnight Club Street Racing look atrocious in comparison, at least when it comes to the modeling detail of the cars anyways. Tokyo Xtreme Racer also has other names due to translations, but for the sake of cohesion, I'm just going to call it Tokyo Xtreme Racer. Moving on, I had actually played Tokyo Xtreme Racer 0, which would be a later title, but not for a long while. And a part of me was curious to see how the first game holds up in comparison, and truthfully, it just doesn't hold up that well, coming from someone that started with Tokyo Xtreme Racer 0 and knew what this game had to offer, since it's essentially the same game, but with less. However, I did still have a good time with the first game and quite enjoyed it, even though it's more repetitive and, like I said, has less. It's just a result of what happens when you start from a later title that's an objective improvement in every sense of the word. So before I continue, I will just say that this game doesn't have anything to offer for those that come from the other games, since they're all pretty much the same except for the Drift series. But for those that haven't played any of them yet, this is a good introduction to start off with. So let's get into it. Tokyo Xtreme Racer takes you into the world of expressway racing, where crews and their members race each other with their own cars. You're a new person among the flock, and now you have a chance to rise through the ranks here. To do so, you'll have to get your first car. Get whatever you can afford, it'll be good enough for a while. In any event, you get dumped into the C1 loop, and in this game, there is only one loop with two variants, inner and outer. Both of them have different turns and corners to memorize, but on the flip side, you'll be racing on them both all the time, and you have plenty of opportunities to practice and nail down the game's weird handling system. The main loop of racing in this game is one-on-one, and no more than that. If you're expecting, a variety of race modes in other racing games or anything else, then you're in the wrong place, because this series dedicates itself to the idea of dueling another fast opponent on a road that allows it. However, if you come from a game like Outrun, where it's more highway racing and you're dueling another opponent, then you might have a good idea of what to expect here. At any rate, you race opponents by beaming your lights at them, and there are several of them on the map. They show up in 3 different colors: blue for not having raced them yet, green for defeated drivers, and pink for not having beaten them yet. The progression of the game here is to beat all of the rivals that this game has to offer, and there are a good number of them. Each rival belongs to a respective crew, and beating all of the drivers in that crew will bring out the leader, who will then challenge you. Your goal in this game is to go after the 4 divas, the 4 main bosses of the game, and to get at them, you have to beat enough crews to earn the right to challenge them. Throughout the game, you'll be racing and customizing, modifying your car to ensure that you can meet the rising difficulty as you get introduced to new crews, new drivers, as well as the diva bosses where you'll need the best parts available just to stand a chance here. This game can be challenging at times, but nothing in comparison to what you see in Zero, especially against the bosses where you generally need to maintain good speed, acceleration, and handling all the time basically. At first, the game is manageable with minimal parts, but then the game will start to crank the difficulty with faster opponents. Tokyo Xtreme Racer is a game that's all about speed, and if you don't have it, you're just going to lose. And how do you get more speed? Well, through customization. The game's customization is pretty basic in comparison to later titles, but the tuning system gives you ways to make your car handle differently. It'll be important to tinker with once you've obtained all stages of the main performance parts. For me though, I didn't do too much with the tuning and focused more on just getting comfortable with the car that I was using. There is some trial and error in this game. When you lose, you do earn some money, but not much. You'll still get another chance to race those opponents, provided that you don't leave the map to go to the main menu. Quite often you'll be going to the main menu just to reset the map rather than doing anything else, because it can only hold so many drivers before it all turns green, and then you have to reset for new drivers in order to continue progressing. For a while I had the S13, which was the first car, but once I had enough, I bought the Supra, and that was more than enough for the 4 divas. Also, this game does have some body customization, although it's limited. However, the color system is great, using the 3 bars, red, green, and blue, to make up any color that you can think of, which is better than just having a set of default colors that you're stuck with. So theoretically, you can come up with any color you want, which is awesome, by the way. And to win the races, you have to deplete their SP meter, which is like their health bar basically. All you have to do is maintain your distance from the opponent at all times. When their SP bar runs out, you win the race, and the opposite happens when you're far behind, which leads to you losing. The entire game revolves around this mechanic, and making mistakes on the road can make it difficult to make a comeback, especially when you're up against the diva bosses. When you do beat the bosses, you get the credits, you get the ending, and you think it's the end, right? Wrong! Not even fucking close. You see, the 4 divas are only just the beginning, and now you have the 4 devils who are even faster, and 3 of them have cars you haven't even seen yet. Beating Ravenblood, which is one of the 4 devils, got me the R34 Skyline, which was good enough to beat the last 2 bosses once it was maxed out. Speaking of the R34, you can also unlock the default version by beating the crew leader Iceman. And speaking of unlocking cars, there are some cars that you can only unlock by doing certain things, but by the end of the game, you should have most of them. At this point in the game, you'll have maxed parts, you'll have a good car to use. For me, it was the Skyline, and plenty of money, which I would recommend saving, by the way, especially for later. You have more crews to race as well, and it's the same goal here. Beat enough of them to race the devils. Beat the devils, and you finally beat the game once more. In later titles, you get a different ending of sorts, but here it's exactly the same, which is disappointing, and when you finish it, there's really nothing more to do other than just to race and grind money and get the bonus cars. When it comes to the car selection and the rival selection, the game established a pretty good foundation here. The car variety is pretty good, and there are some cars you don't often see in other racing games. It's pretty much JDM paradise for those that love them. A lot of 90s cars with some from the 80s making up the roster here too. You can use most of the cars in the arcade mode or in practice just to try them out, but it can be quite a grind to buy them all up in the quest mode, which is the game's career mode basically. And once I had the Skyline and got my hands on the black Porsche, I didn't really need any other car, and by that point, I had beaten all of the rivals, including the final bosses. As for the rivals themselves, their backgrounds make up an interesting world, so to speak. It gets expanded on in later titles, but the few sentences that you have for each driver tells you enough about them as a person on the road. One of the drivers is named Sports Car Killer, whose name comes from the result of an accident during a race with a sports car and has hated those cars ever since. There are also others with their short but unique backstories that gives the game a memorable premise that is unfortunately undercooked here, but would be improved upon in other releases later on. When you beat a rival or a main boss, you can read up their backstories in the rival menu, and it's also a good place to reference your progression towards beating the crews themselves. As for the driving and the handling, it's a bit weird but also somewhat satisfying when you pull off some sick turns. Going at high speeds makes it very difficult to turn though, and during intense races, bumping hard into a wall or into a car up front is the last thing you want to happen, and slowing down can even be risky because the AI's pathfinding on the road is generally pretty good and can attack corners and turns more consistently. It's not necessarily my favorite handling model, and I can tell that it's pretty dated in comparison to later releases, and the physics at times can be very arcadey. The opponents will sometimes fly through you even if they collide with you, and hitting a car, like I said, from the front is suicide. But it is enjoyable enough where I can appreciate the more appealing aspects of the game, like the atmospheric nighttime setting, the roster of cars to drive around in, the decent customization, the interesting rivals and their signature cars, and the intense but satisfying races that the game has. For a game that paved the way for some of the best and most unique racing games to come out in the 2000s, it's a pretty solid starting point. But it's also a game that's pretty limited across the board, and if you've already played Xtreme Racer 2, 0, or 3, there's really no reason to play this game other than just for curiosity's sake and just to see what the game was like before the rest. As for other things like the music, nothing really stood out for me personally, it's just kind of there and nothing necessarily feels out of place here. Tokyo Xtreme Racer 1 for the Dreamcast is, at the end of the day, a pretty good game for what it is, and it holds up really well graphically for a game released in '99 too. Definitely give it a try if you haven't touched any of the Tokyo Xtreme Racer games. Thanks for watching.